Good morning and welcome to Hudson Institute. I'm Daniel Kochis with our Center on Europe and Eurasia. We're very pleased to have you all with us today to talk about the NATO summit. We are now past 100 days since the Washington summit, which followed closely on the heels of Vilnius and prior to that Madrid. And once again, it was a summit to talk about deterrence, bolstering deterrence since Russia's full-scale invasion. And today we're going to do a checkup on that with both Jim Towson and Luke Coffey. Luke Coffey is a colleague of mine in the Center on Europe and Eurasia. And Jim Towson, we're very happy to have you here, who is an adjunct senior fellow with the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for New American Security. At Hudson, we were very pleased to work closely with CNAS, both during and around the Washington summit, as an institutional partner with NATO. And we're very glad that that cooperation can continue today. So perhaps, Jim, if I could ask you to give some opening framing thoughts on how you thought the overall summit went, what the outcomes of those were, specifically focusing on the deterrence piece and what NATO did in Washington to help further that down the line.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to come here. I want to echo what you said about the working relationship between CNAS and Hudson. The other partners as well. That was a difficult project for us to take on. It came upon us very quickly, and it really called for the best in terms of collegial working together to put together such a big part of the summit. And it worked out very well, and you all did a great job. And Luke, it was great working with you.
Yeah, likewise.
So
thank you.
Great to have you on this panel. You know, I think just some framing thoughts from me. If you remember, and Luke, I think we talked about this earlier too, the atmosphere before the summit happened, at least here in Washington, we were afraid where this might go. The Vilnius summit, I think, ended on not a great note because of the Ukraine-NATO struggle trying to figure out the relationship and the membership of Ukraine in NATO. It ended on a bit of an unpleasant note, I think, for a lot of allies. And the fear was that have things changed? Are they going to be able to address this kind of problem for the Washington summit, which was supposed to be a big celebratory event, but in the middle of a war on the continent and problems in the Indo-Pacific? I mean, there were so many issues that Washington summit was going to have to handle. We were afraid that maybe we were going to have another Vilnius, that wasn't going to work, and afraid about unity. And so when the summit actually happened, the opening event, which was at the White House, it was a big welcome event. It seemed to have established such a good atmosphere that the next day, as the summit began to happen, there was this feeling of optimism and a feeling of things that were going to work out okay. Broadly. And so we launched into it, and so the summit took off. For me, in terms of what came out of that summit, this isn't real sexy, this isn't real controversial that we can really dig into, but I think for me, the most important thing was unity. Unity has always been important. You always tip your hat to unity, but it has really become important now as politics in Europe have stirred things up. And my concern was that we were going to look divided, but in fact, we looked unified, and I was relieved at that. And then finally, because I know I've gone on a bit long, Luke, but we're going to talk about Ukraine later, and I'm going to leave that to you, Luke. You and I see this very similarly. But I think in terms of deterrence, in terms of the big job NATO has to try to rebuild and strengthen deterrence against a future Russian aggression, they made some decisions and they began to implement decisions that they talked about at Washington that I was thrilled to see. A lot dealing with the defense industry, a lot dealing with the family of plans that the NATO military authorities have now established, setting up a very strong deterrent front line, beginning up in the Nordic countries all the way down to Turkey, and of course welcoming Sweden and Finland into the alliance, which in and of itself is very important for deterrence and for NATO military capabilities. So at the end of the day, I came away, I'd say about 85, 90% happy. And I'm hard to please. And so that's saying something. But there are some things I think that could have been done better. I'm going to leave that to Luke.
Thank you for those framing comments, Jim. I agreed with you. I thought the unity piece was really important. It was the end of it was Stoltenberg's swan song,
Right.
But there was a nice, I think, transition moment happening there. And the UK had a brand new government. Everybody was still trying to find the bathrooms in the different ministries, and I thought that the continuity and the messaging from the UK was also really very refreshing. But Luke, I think another significant piece of the Washington summit, maybe one that left some folks unsatisfied, was, of course, the Ukraine question. So could you maybe give us some thoughts on how the Washington summit handled the question of support for Ukraine's future NATO relationship?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And again, to echo what Jim was saying about the great experience it was with CNS and Hudson working together at the public forum. I know all my colleagues enjoyed working with your colleagues, and we hope that someday we can do it again.
We'll do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there is, as Jim alluded to, there was some good news stories coming out of the summit, without a doubt. And we're seeing that 100 days on, we are starting to see that these are issues that have stuck around. So these weren't just flashes in the pan. We're still seeing talk about how to improve deterrence. Another good success story, in my opinion, was on the defense spending increases, and we can talk about this maybe in more detail later on the panel. But one area where I felt like the positive news of unity led to a lackluster policy response was over Ukraine. Of course, the alliance remained unified, but they were unified on the lowest common denominator position on what to do for Ukraine at the summit. Heading into the summit, I think the alliance did a good job at managing expectations on what was going to be given to Ukraine in terms of policy outcomes and what the language would be like in the declaration. So you didn't have a repeat of Vilnius the year before. But the summit was, in my opinion, too much about celebrating NATO's history. Of course, this was the 75th anniversary of the alliance. And instead of celebrating NATO's history, I really wish the alliance would have taken the opportunity to make history and to have extended an invitation for Ukraine to join the alliance. An invitation doesn't mean automatic membership, but it does mean commitment. President Zelensky himself has said a number of times that he knows that Ukraine will not join NATO while they are at war with Russia. But in my opinion, there was nothing really stopping an invitation from being extended, knowing that the final date of entry, the final date of membership would be in the future. And I felt like this was a missed opportunity here. And this was mainly driven by opposition from Washington, D.C. and Berlin. So right now we are living with the consequences of this decision. Of all the issues 100 days after the NATO summit, this issue of what does NATO do about Ukraine is the one that is heard the most. And it will be no doubt what we focus on as we head into the next summit at The Hague next summer. And my only advice heading into that summit is that if NATO's leaders don't want to be bold with Ukraine, then somebody better bring a very large English language thesaurus, because they're running out of words to say the same thing over and over again about Ukraine's prospects inside the alliance in the future.
Well, thanks for that, Luke. I remember we had a number of U.S. government representatives, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, coming to the NATO Public Forum and using very similar language around the well-lit bridge with guides and whatnot. And so the last three summits, we've sort of danced around this question about Ukraine's future NATO membership. And it's going to be one which I think likely is going to sort of continue to haunt the alliance next year in the Netherlands. We've seen some reports today that the Russians potentially are negotiating with the Ukrainians around stopping targeting of energy infrastructure. And this has been made possible by Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure. And so do you think that when we get to the NATO summit next year, there'll be, where will we be in terms of alliance restrictions on the usage of Western weapon systems on Russian Federation territory. Do you think that we'll be in a better position next year than we were at the Washington summit this year?
I think a lot will determine on obviously who wins the White House next month in November. A lot of it will determine what the battlefield situation is like in Ukraine and in Kursk Oblast inside the Russian Federation. We have a tendency to eventually make the right decision after months of dithering and indecisiveness. And when we finally make the right decision on providing certain pieces of equipment to Ukraine or lifting certain restrictions, sadly, it's often too late. And this is actually one of the other gripes, I guess you could say, I had with how Ukraine was dealt with at the NATO summit. You had these great announcements, allegedly these great announcements about F-16s and new air defense systems that were at best, recycled announcements that had already been made, but perhaps were repackaged. Or at worst, were announcements that could have been made earlier, that were perhaps held so they had some deliverables at the summit. And I really hope it wasn't the latter, because that would mean that Ukrainians were suffering and coming under a greater threat because NATO members thought they had to have something to show as a deliverable at the summit. I do hope it wasn't that, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was the situation. So I think as we go into the next summit, we will continue having these arguments and these debates about, well, what should NATO's relationship with Ukraine be? What weapons do they need? What restrictions are we going to replace on these weapons? Because this war will still be going on by next summer. Don't be under any illusions that there's any presidential candidate that can end this war in 24 hours. That's just simply not going to happen, mainly because Russia and Ukraine both have a lot of agency in this conflict, and they'll determine when this war will come to an end and under what circumstances. So I think we'll be talking about Ukraine at the summit at The Hague, and probably also at the summit in 2026, which will be, I believe, in Istanbul.
Thank you. Jim, maybe turning to you, if you could put on your former DoD hat, could you talk about where the alliance is in terms of defense planning over the last few years, some of the decisions that have been made, and specifically also talking about in Washington the discussion around defense industrial capacity and trying to expand that, maybe some of the co-production agreements which were announced with Ukraine. If you could focus on that and any progress that was made in Washington on improving Western capacity to produce munitions.
Well, that's a large lunch to digest in terms of a question, but I think when you look at the summit in Washington and you look at the various things, Ukraine being a great example, I think these other points can get lost in terms of the results, what's happened in terms of a lot of good work done since 2014, quite frankly. Defense spending is part of it, but I would say that the NATO military authorities and the international staff particularly jumped in and began to put together these family of plans, these regional plans for how the alliance would actually defend alliance territory, whether it's in Estonia, whether it's in Turkey, whether it's Poland, that what was once theoretical for NATO defense planners. I was a NATO defense planner for the U.S. Back in the day. And so a lot of what we did in 1998, 2002, which is when I was there, was theoretical. And frankly, it didn't deal with territorial defense. It was really out of area. What would NATO allies need to provide if we went out of area, like to Afghanistan? It wasn't really focused on defending the European nations. We hadn't reached that stage of the threat from Russia yet. And unfortunately, we weren't hedging that either. But after 2014, when it was plainly obvious that NATO was going to have trouble, there was this effort by SHAPE to put together the planning for what the actual capabilities were going to be required from allies in order to fight, whether it was in the Nordic area or on the Black Sea, and what will nations have to provide. So the force capabilities that are distributed to allies over time that was based more on potential and what the future might hold. Now it was based on reality. And so nations are being told, your job is to be able to provide this kind of capability right here on time. So, and here's the timeline during which we're going to need to see this arriving. That has not been done since the Cold War. Also, what hasn't been done since the Cold War was exercising on a large scale. And NATO began to do that too. Excuse me. So a lot of what we have seen, particularly at the Washington summit, was agreement on these plans, the money to pay for them, and the expectation, which will be in the next couple of years, that allies will show us that they have now acquired this capability. But from a defense industry, unfortunately, whether it's in Europe or in the United States, that cannot surge the way we might have done in the past when there was a greater capability or capacity within the defense industry. What we are seeing on both sides of the Atlantic is that while the requirement is there for allies, and they are beginning to put down the contracts, and they actually put money towards the contracts, the delivery schedule for a lot of the stuff that they need is going to be 10 years or 15 years. It's not something that's going to come within that time span when the allies feel we're going to need it. It'll come afterwards. And so there is quite an effort, as you point out in the question, to do co-production, to do joint purchasing, trying to jumpstart what is a defense industrial capacity that is more suited for peacetime rather than wartime.
Thank you, Jim. Another component of the summit, of course, was looking into future NATO in terms of NATO's open door. So, Luke, the summit declaration once again reaffirmed, in theory, the principles of the open door policy for the alliance. But in practice, is this de facto a dead letter for the foreseeable future?
Well, of course, all of the straightforward, easy cases are, in terms of countries that want to join NATO, are in the alliance. What's remaining in Europe are the more difficult, geopolitically complex, more challenging countries that have these unique circumstances, whether it's Bosnia and Herzegovina or Ukraine, of course. No, Moldova isn't a NATO aspirant country, but Moldova is getting closer relations with NATO. And of course, Georgia. And actually, I would say, to me, one of the biggest unreported stories out of the summit was the fact that Georgia's NATO aspirations were removed from the final declaration. I mean, a country who would normally get about one or two good-sized paragraphs in each declaration about Georgia's futures in NATO, and they need to do this, and they need to do that, and NATO-Georgian cooperation has been so effective in Afghanistan and the Black Sea, was gone. You look at the declaration, and you won't find the paragraph about Georgia. And that's a reflection of the political environment on the ground in Georgia that has been the case over the past few years, that has really culminated recently, if you're watching this live, with elections they had in Georgia where the Georgian Dream incumbent political party won under what many suspect being dubious circumstances. And the Georgian Dream Party has been certainly sympathetic to Moscow's worldview in recent years, and one could even argue today is now in the Kremlin's orbit. So yeah, I think while the door isn't technically closed, I mean de facto, it doesn't really seem to be that open either, and that's why I think we have to celebrate the entry of Finland and Sweden into the alliance to show that yes, the door is open, NATO is still enlarging. We have to find creative ways to deal with the circumstances that Bosnia and Herzegovina is facing when it comes to NATO membership. And we have to, I really think, be bold when it comes to Ukraine. As I already mentioned, I don't see why NATO cannot extend an invitation for Ukraine to join the alliance. I think that would send a positive signal to the Ukrainians. I think it would send a very important signal to Russia that right now they don't have a de facto veto on NATO enlargement. And let's be honest, they do right now. I mean, Russia has perfected the formula to keep NATO's open door closed. Partial invasion, or invasion and then partial occupation of a country means that that country's Euro-Atlantic prospects remain very dim. So I wish there would have been a little more focus on NATO enlargement at the summit. Just understanding the political constraints regarding Ukraine, I felt like more could have been done to just explain enlargement, how it works, why it's important, how NATO enlargement brings stability across the European continent and in the transatlantic community. And I hope as we're 100 days past the summit, the top issue, as I mentioned, being debated is an enlargement issue. It pertains to Ukraine. And I think this will continue on behind the scenes up into the next summit. But we should do what we can to make this a more public debate, explaining why enlargement is important and why it benefits the alliance.
And we saw the fruits of enlargement. This was the first summit where Sweden took part as a full member. And obviously Sweden and Finland's inclusion has greatly enhanced our deterrence and our capabilities within the alliance. For me, the two sort of pieces that were hanging over, I think, what was generally a very positive summit in celebrating 75 years were both, one, the future of the U.S. Commitment, the U.S. presidential election. There was the questions about who the Democratic nominee would be at the time, and obviously the potential for Donald Trump to return to office and what his policy would look like. And the second being the hybrid attacks, the Russian hybrid attacks, which are seemingly growing to a crescendo over recent months. So if I could ask maybe two related questions. One, so we talked about the good news around defense spending, that 2/3 of allies are hitting the 2% benchmark. Everyone essentially is hitting the 20% benchmark. But is the conversation now moving beyond 2%? To somewhere like 2.5 or 3%. Do you see that target shifting in principle over the next few summits, or do you think that will stay the same? And then the second one on the hybrid piece, did the summit adequately address or discuss the hybrid attacks and maybe avenues for NATO to try to push Russia on those and respond to those better in the future? That's for either of you, if you'd like to take that one.
Well, I think in terms of, actually, I'll take the hybrid. How about that? Or unless you'd like
No,
to
go ahead. Have the hybrid.
This is an example of Hudson, CNAS working together. So, but on the hybrid.
No, wait, I want the hybrid. Yeah. No, I'm joking.
Oh, well, please, thank you. So on hybrid, I feel that we're in a deep hole in concerning how does the alliance deal with hybrid, the hybrid threat. Hybrid can be misinformation. It can be a cyber attack. It could be sabotage. It could be an assassination attempt. There's all kinds of things. Pipelines being blown up or cables being disturbed. There's a lot of things that can come under that hybrid rubric, and not a lot of it can be addressed by what NATO does. A lot of this is also domestic. It's law enforcement. It's other things like that. And we have not, I don't think we've really broken the code on how does NATO work with the EU and with domestic actors to deal with something that doesn't belong to NATO specifically or to the EU or even, and can overwhelm the domestic capacity. So how do you deal with hybrid in a way that makes sense? I think we're still trying to work that out. I don't think the summit, I'm not even sure the summit addressed it adequately at all. But we're beginning to see this is becoming a tool of choice by the Russians. It's the gray zone. It's below Article 5. So how do we deal with this? I think we need to deal with it first in terms of NATO and the European Union. I know that can sound like it's a big talk shop, these guys coming together and admiring the problem, but a lot of what the EU and the domestic EU member nations, they've got they've got more of the tools, certainly than NATO does, to provide security and to provide early warning, as well as the law enforcement needed to stop something like an assassination attempt or some act of sabotage. If a nation feels overwhelmed and can't do it, I think that's where the EU and NATO can come together and say, what can we do to help these people out, to deal with guarding their borders or providing security on imports or cyber. I mean, certainly NATO does a lot on the cyber side. So I think we've got to pay more attention to that and to the idea of resilience generally. how can society withstand, whether it's during actual war and conflict or the gray zone, how can society itself keep its institutions going, its governance going under pressure? And so a lot of it is getting the public at a place where they understand what their role is as pressure builds from Russia. How can they help deal and push back on and be resilient against hybrid attacks?
Thank you, Jim, and I couldn't agree more. And I think that this is an area where our newest allies within the alliance can actually teach us quite a bit about
Right.
total defense and something that they can be helpful for the rest of us. So, Luke, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, so Jim just hit the nail on the head when it comes to hybrid warfare in NATO, and that is, NATO lacks many of the policy competencies that are required to deal with the hybrid threat. I want to say a few things about the defense spending issue, but just to add a couple more points on the hybrid aspect. If your country is involved in a hybrid war, it probably means you're losing it. The idea should be to create societal conditions where a country isn't susceptible, its population is not susceptible to these hybrid threats. You need to have good governance at the local, national, and in the case of Europe, the European Union supranational level. If people feel like they're governed well and governed fairly, they become less susceptible to hybrid attacks. You need economic opportunity and economic growth. If people feel like they have an economic future and they have a stake in the economic future, then they become less susceptible to these hybrid attacks. And finally, you need trust in local law enforcement and national security services and intelligence agencies. If people feel like that they're policed fairly or monitored within the law, then they become less susceptible to the hybrid attacks. And this is a Europe problem. This is also a US problem. And look at our society, our politics. You have the left saying that police departments should be disbanded. You have the right saying that the FBI needs to be disbanded. And this situation is ripe for Russian hybrid warfare. On the point about spending, again, probably one of the best good news stories out of the summit. More needs to be done. I think 3 things can be done. Firstly, we need to keep up the pressure publicly and in a very appropriate way, but also privately, making the case to the partners and allies in Europe who don't spend the 2% to get to that point. We need to keep this as a debating topic going forward until all members spend 2%, at least 2% of GDP on defense. Second thing we need to do is maybe think about how we measure 2%. You can go to the NATO website and you can see how NATO defines 2% for defense spending. And it includes things like civil service pensions and the ministries of defense, things like this. But what it doesn't include is cross-departmental cybersecurity spending on countering disinformation, energy security spending. And these are things that in the 21st century should be very much viewed as part of the security of the alliance. So maybe it's time we update the definition of 2%. Finally, and this is something I've been advocating for a decade now, so I'm certain it's never going to happen, but I'm going to say it anyway. We need to have finance ministers or their equivalent involved at the NATO level. In a US presidential system of government, the legislative branch has the appropriations and the authorizations authority for government spending. Whereas in most parliamentary democracies, this is the prerogative of the finance minister, but really the head of government, the prime minister, working with the finance minister. And most parliaments, most legislative branches have very little say in the budget. It's usually considered the approval of the annual budget is considered like a vote of confidence in the government every year. But it's not like the parliaments in European parliamentary democracies have the same powers that the US Congress does in our presidential system of government. So why don't we have the people who are controlling this spending, the finance ministers, more involved at the NATO level? They're the ones who need to understand why defense is so expensive, why it's so important, and where this money goes. So I think it'd make perfect sense at the next summit in The Hague to have a special finance ministers or their equivalent session so they can get more involved and feel like they have more of a stake in this debate about defense spending.
Thank you.
But I'm not holding my breath.
Thanks for that suggestion, Luke. One other area while I have you here that I wanted to touch on was the evolution of NATO in regards to China. We saw the new strategic concept a few years ago discuss China very differently than the one over a decade prior. And I thought that the summit declaration was pretty robust on the question of China. Obviously, this is driven in large part because of China's support for Russia in the war against Ukraine. But how do you see that relationship between NATO's role and China, and also NATO's role with the IP4 partners, the Indo-Pacific partners who were for the third time at a NATO summit? If either one of you have any thoughts on that discussion.
Well, I'll just jump in and say that in bringing in partners from Asia Pacific actually has been going on for a while. Back when I was at NATO, 2002 was when I left. There was already work to bring in New Zealand and Australia and Japan to be part of this, and this was before the rise of China and the on all of the issues that brought to NATO and to the United States. So it's been there, and I'm glad because it gave us a platform from which to consult and to take best ideas from those partners on how to deal with China and the whole Indo-Pacific region. So it's only grown and gotten more richer and deeper for the alliance, which has been great. Concerning China itself, that was quite a big effort starting, I would say towards the end of the Obama administration, where the feeling was NATO needed to get more involved in understanding our concerns with China. Not that we were asking NATO to get involved in the Indo-Pacific, but to understand our view of the world and where the requirements might be on the U.S. military. It won't be just Europe. This was the so-called pivot to Asia, but that we would also need to be stretched thin to deal with the Indo-Pacific. So it was at the very end of the Obama administration where we made a big push to put China on the agenda, and it was difficult. Because in Europe, the relationship between individual European nations and the EU with China, based on a very strong trade relationship, particularly for countries like Germany. So they weren't about in a place where they wanted to do some things that would upset that trading relationship because the US is having a problem. And so bringing that into NATO was controversial and was difficult. And so by the time we get to the Washington summit and that new strategic concept, that was quite an achievement to have allies better understand where we're coming from and the role they and NATO might play in terms of whether it's sanctions or whatever it might be, but to understand that while China might look different in Berlin than it does in Washington, what Washington is seeing and dealing with in terms of China is going to impact Europe and Germany, and that we need to together deal with this rise of China. So it was quite an achievement.
Thank you.
Using the language, the language that was used, the strategic enabler, describing China as the strategic enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine, I thought was a notable achievement. I think it's right and proper that NATO as an institution works with partners in the Indo-Pacific to understand how they see security concerns so we can identify where there's overlap in security concerns. But when it comes to NATO's overall approach to China, I view it similarly to how I view NATO's role with hybrid warfare. It is a tool in the toolbox, but it's not the toolbox itself for many of the same reasons. NATO lacks the policy competencies to deal with many of the threats and challenges that China poses to NATO's member states. We're worried about questionable and dodgy investments by China into infrastructure, ports, rail links, airports across Europe. Well, NATO doesn't have the tools to regulate this or to assess this. This is something that has to be done at the nation state level or at the EU level. Same thing with questionable investments in 5G technology and Huawei and how that might have national security implications. NATO isn't set up to deal with this, but the member states are, and they have to be dealing with this, because even though NATO doesn't have the policy competencies, NATO is certainly impacted by what China is doing in Europe. So I think we have to keep the issue of China on the table, especially after, as we head into the Hague summit. It's interesting because the issue with China is one that I view as kind of being a flash in the pan for NATO. It's the issue that you hear about leading up to a summit and then at the summit, but then it really dies down until the next summit comes around. So maybe we need to have a more steady drumbeat on examining, what the issues are as they pertain to NATO, as they pertain to our partners in the Indo-Pacific, more, continuously as opposed to just irregularly.
If I could add to that
Please.
real quick, I think you're absolutely right, and I think where you see the continuance is on bilateral relations, say between the United States and Germany, or some of the other nations, or within the EU, where we take what we all agreed to at NATO in terms of China and the Chinese relationship with Europe and this type of thing, the threat, if you will. And then bilaterally, when we go to work with Germany on electric vehicles or whatever it is, we have a starting place that we've all agreed on this. And now let's you and I, Germany and the US, or the US and the Dutch, or whatever it might be, let's see where we need to go with this, because we've all agreed on the context. What are the concrete things that we need to do bilaterally to achieve what we kind of laid out? So I think a lot of that continuity you see quietly bilaterally, but NATO at least gives us a common platform from which to go.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think we've covered a lot of ground. And overall, at the Washington Summit, we found ourselves in a pretty good place with political unity, with doing a lot of the sort of unsexy things around planning that are so essential for the alliance, around defense spending, as we touched upon. But clearly, the challenges are broad and they're real, and we'll be facing these challenges, whether it's the Russian hybrid war or the war against Ukraine, very likely next summer. If maybe in conclusion, if you have one or two wish list items that you would like to see next summer at our summit in the Netherlands, NATO hit or address in that summit, what would those be? Jim, maybe we'll start with you as our guest.
Well, thanks. I think what I would, on my wish list, and I'm sure, Luke, I'll be taking some of yours. I'll try to leave some for you too. But I hope, and this might be an out of the box wish, but I sure hope that there can be an acknowledgement that 2% is not enough, that they've moved to 2.5% in terms of GDP spent on defense, and that there's unity behind that, and not struggling as it has been in the past over the 2%. So that's the first thing that I hope we see. The second thing I hope we see, and I'm going to leave Ukraine for you, Luke, because I know that's a big wish for you. Second thing I hope we see is a lot of the restrictions that are bilateral, but I think a lot of the restrictions that the U.S. and other allies might have on providing assistance to Ukraine, that those restrictions are by that time lifted, and that we have a better flow of assistance going to Ukraine to help them win, and not tying their hand behind their backs. I hope that we can see that by July or whenever the summit's going to be next year. I hope that'll be a second thing that we'll see come about.
Well, we have the largest land war taking place in Europe since the Second World War. We have the first time in the 21st century that one state has used military force to forcibly take and annex part of another state. In fact, this was Russia doing this to Ukraine is the first time this has happened since 1990 with Saddam Hussein and Kuwait. We have Iranian drones being used daily against Ukrainian cities, sometimes encroaching into NATO airspace. We have North Korean ballistic missiles being fired at Ukrainian cities, and now we have North Korean troops fighting Ukrainians in Kursk Oblast. We need to wake up and understand that we are living through historical times. We're living through so much history every week. And I feel like there is a lack of awareness and appreciation by our policymakers and our leaders to recognize the historical times in which we are living. the future security and stability and prosperity of not only Europe, but the Eurasian landmass is going to be determined by what happens or doesn't happen in Ukraine. And here we have this opportunity to shape an outcome that benefits America and our partners and our allies, both in Europe and in East Asia. And we just find ourselves continuously wandering blindly through all of this, just hoping that it's all going to work out, when we're not doing much to actually ensure that it will work out. So at the summit, my hope is that we start arming Ukraine to win and not just to survive. And we do this in a way that ensures that Ukraine finds its path inside the alliance sooner than later.
Well, thank you both for those thoughtful wish list items and for your cogent remarks. Luke and Jim, thank you both for being here. Thank you to CNAS for your continued partnership. And thank you to our audience, both in person and online, for taking part. That concludes our event for today, and we look forward to having you here for another Hudson Institute event in the near future. Thank you.